When you grow up here, you're told Australia is a young country. Then you read that people have been here for at least 60,000 years, and suddenly the whole story feels off. My guest today, historian Billy Griffiths, has spent years sitting with that deep time, spending time on digs in places like Kakadu, reading the diaries of explorers who barely understood what they were seeing, and collaborating with archaeologists and Indigenous knowledge holders who are still uncovering this place. We talk about why archaeology in Australia took so long to get going, what we still don't know about the first people who crossed the water to get here, and how imagination and humility might help us see this continent more clearly. A lot of people, well, my generation, maybe even a little bit older, they hear the term archaeology, and first thing that springs to my mind is Indiana Jones. That's sort of that time that I grew up with, all that excitement and action and everything. What was it specifically that drew you into archaeology and history and, discussing these kinds of things?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. For starters, I'll just start off by saying that Indiana Jones is a shocking archaeologist. He is a looter. He takes stuff. He robs tombs. He is the worst type of archaeologist out there, even though he has great fun doing on his adventures. I've always been interested in archaeology, but my way in has been through history. I'm a historian, but I've always been frustrated by the limits of my discipline, and especially when I write about Australia. The written sources for this continent go back only a few centuries, and the history here goes back tens of thousands of years, and saying that number is itself an insight that's been emerged from archaeology. So I tried to push those limitations, and that's what led me into joining archaeological excavations and finding a way to deal with and understand a bit more about the archaeology, particularly the archaeology of Australia. But how do we make sense of a history, a past, when we're working from material remains, when we're working from landscapes? It's a different way of thinking, a different way of looking, and so I dived straight in and volunteered as a camp cook on an excavation in Arnhem Land, and that was such a powerful experience that it kind of propelled me on this journey, still in history, but very much involved in archaeology these days.
Literally, yesterday I finished reading Deep Time Dreaming, and partly the reason why I wanted to have a chat to you is sort of have an interest in Australian history, but feel a bit, sort of almost ashamed of not really knowing much about it at all. So I found your book very, very easy access to sort of, dip your toe in and learn not just, about the actual sites and the archaeology, what they've, found, but more of the storyline of how that came to be. And one of the things that stood out to me was how young, archaeology is in Australia, which I had no idea about. Can you just, maybe give us a little bit of background on when that process, started in terms of a adolescent science rather than just a, sort of hodgepodge of people digging and looting like you mentioned?
People have been thinking archaeologically since as long as people have been here on the continent, because of course you can infer things from landscapes, and that's what's happened for thousands of years. But when Europeans got to Australia, they confined their interest largely to the surface of surface collecting, basically seeing what was on the surface. And part of the imperative there was they didn't dig because they thought there would be nothing to find. There was an idea that Aboriginal people had been here for not very long, and they didn't have a history. Indeed, they were a fossilized stage of evolution in a Western history. There were some very warped evolutionary assumptions, which caused it was really slow to build. But then things changed very quickly in the wake of the Second World War. And with the Manhattan Project, a whole series of new technologies came into play, including radiocarbon dating, which allowed scientists to put a date on anything from charcoal or carbon, anything that had been alive and then died and then buried. You could put a date on that through radiocarbon dating. In Australia, people like John Mulvaney, well, really, it was John Mulvaney who took this technology and also a different approach to understanding the history of the continent, treating it as a history, thinking there must be a history here, and let's find out, let's excavate, let's put dates to this, and he's building on, again, the work of others such as Norman Tyndale and Frederick McCarthy, these others who have been thinking about the past, but really still trapped in these evolutionary assumptions. It's really with John Mulvaney and Isabel McBride that you get a historical assessment of the past. And John Mulvaney's first work was on the banks of the Murray River, and really near the mouth from his landing. Isabel McBride did these massive regional surveys across New England in New South Wales, and they both found a very varied archaeology, which told them that there was so much to learn and just discover. So it's so, we're talking 1960s, things are really starting to gather pace. But even then, they still have this idea that the history of the continent only goes back a few thousand years. It was with Kenneth Cave, this work in West Queensland that John Mulvaney did, that suddenly the date was propelled into the last ice age, and we knew that people had been here for a very, very long time indeed. And so the dates keep, with every decade, they go up another 10, 20, 30,000 years. With Lake Mungo in the 70s, you've got the 40,000 emerge, and then that becomes a catch cry straight into the Aboriginal land rights movement. We've been here for 40,000 years, and give us back our land. It's so the story of this discipline, of this has a shifting kind of intellectual focus on history, but also this incredibly resurgent voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who weren't involved in the first excavations and were a bit put off. Why weren't we? This is our heritage. This is our history. This is our land. And so the discipline begins very quickly. Suddenly the continent starts being populated with some small bits of information about the deep past, and then that becomes a much more interesting and complex cross-cultural enterprise, and that's where it is today. There's no longer people going out and digging to see what they can find. It is a collaborative process where the questions that are being asked from archaeology are very much Indigenous led and community embedded, and the insights are, because of that, are becoming so much more so much richer, and we're so far away from that evolutionary era, which really was only in a historian or an archaeologist's point of view, not very long ago. So the last 60 years or so have been absolutely transformative for Australian history.
Yeah, I was amazed actually reading some of the stories, and like you said, John Mulvaney, like at the start, he was the only I guess Western trained archaeologist in Australia for a period of time, which was literally, like my parents were alive when that happened. It's not very long ago at all, which sort of blew me away. How much, I guess, like you said, how much can sort of happen in that short space of time, but how far we've got to go, really, because there's it's not really like there's much that's, in the grand scheme of things, how big the country is. What's still left to be uncovered would be pretty exciting and pretty fascinating.
Yeah, the work that's underway at the moment is very exciting, and I think we're going to learn a lot in the next decade. Even there is so much work underway, and it's happening on the drowned continental shelves with this underwater archaeology, on sea country, finding these submerged floors. So let me step back. Why would people be looking at underwater archaeology? Because when people arrived in the continent, the continent was a third larger than it is today. It's huge, and Tasmania was connected to the mainland, as was New Guinea, and that it has transformed while people have been here. So that's 65,000 years, or 60 to 70,000 years. And the last ice age is when the continent became its biggest. And then in the wake of the last ice age, which peaked about 21,000 years ago, sea levels rose by 130 meters. 130 meters. So this incredible transformation was experienced, witnessed, was and has endured. What is remarkable, this post-glacial sea level rise has endured in the histories and cultural stories of people today. So there is remarkably many accounts now of sea level rise embedded in story, which has been passed from generation to generation in an enduring memory system across over 10,000 years. So we are getting these insights into this, not only this deep history, but this also radically different place that has remained still, peopled throughout. And then we're talking people hunting from the glaciers extending from the Tasmanian ice cap and roaming across the desert interior where there were also sand dunes rolling through in this kind of great reconfiguration of the inland, and then these landscapes, these coastal landscapes, the rich riverine landscapes that become inundated, flooded by the end of the last ice age, the extended polar ice caps, which are bulging, they suddenly melt, and not suddenly, but it is pretty rapid. It's from about 130 meters is a lot, and that was experienced in different ways in different regions. So in some places, with every tide, the sea advanced across vast areas where you lose kilometers every generation, kilometers of land every generation. And in other areas where kind of water pushed up against a range, such as in the Bassian Plain, the area between Tasmania and continental Australia, you can imagine the breach would have happened really suddenly in a storm surge. It would have happened so quickly, you can imagine a family group being separated on either side of the range and seeing the land bridge break and water flow. So it's that's why there's we've got more work the more we understand, the more vivid our narrative about the deep past becomes, and then the more targeted our questions become. So why would people be looking at the seabed? Because we know that would have been somewhere that was a major hub of activity, perhaps even more important than some of the sites today, because some ecological modelling suggests that these drowned landscapes were very dense population points. So that's why people would be looking under the sea now. But we're also being guided by this, instead of ignoring and pushing away or trying to explain away the Indigenous narratives about the past, where we're being led by and guided by questions that are coming from people whose country it is, and that changes the questions that we ask about the past, and we get more interesting answers.
If we can't truly know the past, how should we use historical imagination when we think about the first Australians?
Yeah, so I think a historical imagination is vital for any inquiry into the past. But the caveat is we can never know what happened in the past, and it would be outrageous to presume you could. So it's so foreign, and yet still you can't begin to understand a different time without doing your best to journey into that place, and even just to think, okay, what does the landscape look at this time? What are the major pressures? What's happening? And I think this is the exciting thing for me as a historian thinking about the continent. I want us more to move away from thinking about big dates and thinking, oh, here's a 65,000 years is a big number, but what does it tell you apart from people have been here a very long time? And that's something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples can tell you straight away. They've been here forever, and they might as well have been. That is such an unfathomable period of time, well before people have been modern Homo sapiens have been in Europe. It's a really in fact the journey to Australia was a major point in human evolution as well, because it required this sea crossing across a vast passage of water, open sea voyaging, at a time when that was previously thought to be impossible. Yet it had to have happened, and we're now learning more and more and more about that journey into Australia too, and can appreciate that the founding of Australia was much larger and more diverse than we previously appreciated. We're talking open sea voyaging, two-way voyaging, coming to the continent and back, a founding population of around about 1,500 people coming to the continent over a period of 7 centuries. That's a huge amount of people, and that's very targeted and purposeful. It's even just trying to answer the question of how do you think about that journey. You've got to put yourself into the perspective of those voyagers. They must have known where they were going. They must have, because you don't equip your family and go onto this kind of watercraft that and provision it for this kind of over the horizon voyaging if you don't know where you're going. Because these are extended family groups taking to the seas, going across a distance of several island hops, but one distance of about 100 kilometers of open sea, and then arriving in a different environment, kind of similar to the kind of tropical environments of Wallacea, where they're coming from, Indonesia, but also fundamentally different. And especially as they come further inland, it's the biology is so different to anything they must have encountered ever before. So imagination is required in order to take that leap back into the past and ask good questions about how people might have journeyed and made the continent their own. Yet there are limits too, and I'm always aware of those, and I don't try and have a romantic appreciation too much of what I do in this time. Yeah, it's much more about how does this push our investigation into the past.
How do we think the very first people actually got to Greater Australia, and what do we understand about when they arrived and what happened in those early years after landfall?
Yeah, so there's two routes that are kind of hotly debated. This kind of Paleo-Kimberley coastline, somewhere far out from where the Kimberley is, with a crossing from Timor. And the other is coming through the Bird's Head of New Guinea. It's called the Bird's Head because it looks a bit like a bird's head, the top of New Guinea. And it seems both were probably pathways, but the Paleo-Kimberley coastline of Sahul, which is what we call Greater Australia, is the most likely landing point. But again, this insight about the founding population, which comes from genetic analyses, as well as this demographic studies about the survival of societies. In order for a society to survive, it's got to pass certain extinction thresholds. And so in order for a continent to be populated and to remain populated for 65,000 years and to have the diversity of lineages, genetic lineages that we have today, it shows that it was quite a large founding group. what happened next, I suppose, is a big question, and we use the number 65,000 years, and that's got an error margin of 5,000 either way. So really, we should be saying 60 to 70,000 years. That's a more general kind of estimate for the oldest site, and that's the oldest site comes from Arnhem Land. Happened to be the place I volunteered as camp cook on that very first excavation I joined that produced that date. But it's still somewhat of an outlier, but we're getting more and more information about a lot of sites around 50,000 and the high 50s, and there are more in the works right now, which show this kind of rapid movement after an initial settling in the very northern reaches of the continent, rapidly populating the rest of the continent, and then when the land bridge to Tasmania opened, because the sea level was going up and down a bit, people come straight across about 43,000 years ago. So the entire continent is populated by that stage. And these are very radically different environments, of course. The heart of the desert, interior, the northern rainforests. It's the movement in these areas have been likened to superhighways, kind of connection, which have endured today as well. So there's rapid movement, but then there's also ongoing connection through some of these movement pathways. Anyway, it's definitely a large point of research at the moment. It's a lot of questions are being asked about how once people got here, where did they go, and but it is also in some ways it's so far back in time, and that we should be attending just as much to the Indigenous assertions of their own understanding of country and how long have they been here. They've been here forever in some eyes. Sometimes it's a migration narrative, but it is such a long time that you have incredible diversity very early, and some people have stayed on country for that time, but the country itself has transformed in terms of the environmental transformations of the last ice age.
I'd be fascinated to know actually some of those, if you knew a little bit more detail about some of those immigration stories that different different regions had, or what they talk about in terms of the immigration to certain areas.
Yes, and there are so many stories. It'd be hard to do justice, and they're so different too. So it's in our new book, The First Inventors, we touch on some of them, but I'm hesitant to dive in without doing them justice, because they're so layered and embedded in place and embedded with knowledge about that place that anything any way I summarize them is going to be a bit like saying the Odyssey was all about a trip home from war. Just you lose all the power of the story, and the story is in the power and in the repetitions, the rhythm and the emplacement, how much it is bound to place. And yeah.
No, fair enough. Definitely. That that actually leads me into another point where similar vein, where a lot of, I probably fall into this trap sometimes too, but a lot of people still talk about Aboriginal culture as being one thing, whereas obviously the scale and diversity of the continent and the time frame we're looking like, there's obviously so much that fits into that, so it's a bit strange to actually use that term in the first place.
Yeah, and you see that diversity even from the get-go. I mean, that's what with the founding population would have had diversity of within it, but I understand too why Aboriginal culture has emerged as a unifying force, because as a counter to empire. You kind of got the empire on one side and then the Aboriginal culture on the other. So the arrival of Europeans and British and to stay on this continent and has required a unifying voice. It's But it's really worth always remembering the incredible diversity of perspectives, of histories, um, and of country. I mean, Australia is an incredibly varied place, and of course, people have different experiences in different places, um, and that is, I think, one of the ways archaeology has evolved has been moving from continental questions um, to understanding regional and even very local understandings of place. It doesn't mean these aren't also bound up with kind of connections across the continent, but if you're starting with a specific place, you get better answers than if you're trying to use this small hole in the ground to tell you about an entire continent or an entire state.
The way we describe, or especially in the book in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the older viewpoints were from Aboriginal society as being less advanced and less technical and all that sort of thing, from very Western viewpoint. Whereas obviously, the Aboriginal people constantly changing their society and very complicated and very advanced in a different way, but we still bring that baggage from more of a Western viewpoint when we're discussing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the solution is to deliberately shed that baggage and try and understand um, the history here on its own terms, and the innovations and the inventions and the engineering that's happened here on its own terms. Because if you try and fit what we see happening here into a preconceived concept or construct, then you're not doing any justice to the extraordinary dynamism of the cultures here, and you're not going to get um, uh, uh, very interesting answers. You're just going to get, oh, there's a category that you can impose here, and but if we can see what's happening at in each individual place, then you stop being blind. You kind of, if you go in with a singular lens, you become blind to what's around you, and that is something that can happen to all of us, and I think has happened a lot in this space. And this is again why collaborative research is so important, because it takes those blinkers away and allows you to understand what's important and to appreciate different appreciate some different questions. So that's a very rambly answer, but let me tangible examples. We didn't appreciate the scale of burning on the continent, or the way people used fire to cultivate landscapes. And that is something that has transformed over the past 50, 60 years. And now we really are guided by Indigenous knowledge of country and Indigenous knowledge of burning to manage country today. But the burning itself is so fundamentally different to other practices, a whole different term. Fire stick farming is one of the ways we've learned to describe it. And that is again, a very generalized way of understanding specific ways of managing country, looking after country, caring for country.
When because your new book is based on the First Inventors TV show, is that right?
Yeah, very loosely. Yeah, it is. It grows loosely out of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, great. So, because obviously watching that as well, and the sort of segments they speak to, the do they call them burn masters or fire masters? Traditionally, I think it was in Queensland. That was fascinating how he was explaining the whole process of burning and where they target certain plants and the patterns that they use. And obviously, it's such a science to it, and you can see how not just anyone, you have to really learn it and develop that craft.
Yeah, so this is Victor Stephenson you're talking about, who is a fire master, Tagalaka man, and incredibly gifted communicator as well. He's written a couple of beautiful books now, and he was on the show, and we feature him in the First Amendments, the book, as well. So I think the insight that comes from the work he's doing at the moment, which is looking after country, burning country, particularly in Queensland, where he's from, but also in other regions too, providing advice is burning according to the ecology that is there, and I think there's a kind of gentle burning is key. But again, I'm doing blanket things. There's no blanket understanding of approaches to burning and shaping landscapes, because every landscape, every ecology needs to be burnt differently, and this deep knowledge of country informs how a landscape can be burnt, maybe in a mosaic pattern, just as a routine hunting practice to kind of burn to flush animals, and then that in itself creates a staggered pattern across of vegetation and fuel loads. And this has the benefit of protecting against big fires that wildfires that might take hold, but also to establish these kind of cycles for which of plant life, but also of animal life, that can enrich country, be beneficial to people and country alike. So fire is the kind of really obvious example. We highlight it in the show about how landscapes have been transformed and engineered. I think water is another key insight. We're still really trying to fathom the Indigenous water management on the continent. And you look at something like the aquaculture at Budge Bim, these incredible eel traps that have been created. Beg your pardon, sorry. You look at these incredible eel traps that have been created. The whole landscape has been domesticated with eels in mind. There's kind of this incredible alliance with eels has transformed an entire region. And what do eels like? They spawn up in New Caledonia, and in the waters of New Caledonia, and then they journey all the way to the Australian coastline and pop up places like Western Victoria, and then they journey inland in these huge epic migrations. And knowledge of these migrations has allowed people to then shape the landscape to promote eels coming there and then staying there. Because what do eels like more than anything? They like slow-moving waters. They like holding ponds that they can get fat in, and they will eat anything. They will eat birds. They'll eat rats. They'll eat fish, of course. They grow and grow and grow until they're ready to return to their spawning grounds many years later. And so in Western Victoria, we see this on Goonitj Murray country, Budge Bim, we see this incredible region that has been shaped around eels and with waterways connected, and this incredibly maze of channels that have been either dug into the plain or pulled out of the basalt and kind of mounded up on the side with these structures to ensure that water, when it comes to the landscape, to Teirak or Lake Kunda, it will stay there and then move across the landscape slowly. And then these holding ponds, some of the size of the MCG, where eels can grow, they become like fridges in the landscape. So when you want food, you can have it easily obtainable and at hand. Just harvest from these holding ponds. So it's a incredible story, on the Turundara lava flow, and we can see it survived there, and it's been recognised with World Heritage status, which is wonderful. This type of water management is also replicated elsewhere across the continent, and these water controls and management of fish populations throughout rivers, we're beginning to understand more and more about it. But the first Europeans, the first newcomers to come to the area, they couldn't see it, and that was partly because they weren't trained to see aquaculture in this vein. So a weir could be built around a tree that had been deliberately felled across a river, and the first thing a newcomer comes and does is just clear the tree, and as a result, suddenly the fish populations are no longer being corralled in certain areas of the river, and management starts to break down quickly. Similarly, with wells and that are built across country and maintained, well, creating these sanctuary areas where water is available for people, but also for animals. As sheep and cows come into and roam across the plains, they're turning up the topsoil, and they're literally burying these wells, and so water starts to disappear from the landscape, and we don't have so much water. It's drier now than it was 200 or 300 years ago, significantly, and that's not just the story of climate change, though it is partly that too. It's also, Tayrak, the Lake Condah, used to be in flood, and the water stayed in the landscape pretty much all year round. It was a permanent water source. Now it's only got water for small parts of the year, and we're seeing this kind of draining of the landscape. So there's another example of the complexity of management is so. You kind of, once you start looking at it and start opening your mind to it, then you see so much. But if you're not looking for it in the first place, then you've closed your mind to it, and you can't appreciate it on its own terms. And that's, yeah. I could give you more examples, but
No, it's fascinating, and I had no idea about that the eels actually travel that far from their spawning grounds, which is amazing. Let alone, I didn't actually even know that eels were that widespread in Australia, to be honest. But it's fascinating how that level of complexity, because the Budgebim is like we think the aftermath of the volcanic eruption, and then the basalt from that was how those sort of areas formed. And then that's been, how long ago did that volcano erupt? Do we know?
There's a few eruptions. I think it's 38,000 years ago was the last for the Budgebim. But there's also other volcanoes in Western Victoria, it's a volcanic area, which are more recent.
Okay.
And the reason the volcanic plains were so valuable is because you could leverage up the basalt blocks and quickly create quite a permanent channel, which was perfect for being able to move water between and across country, and extend the range of water to new parts of country.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You did touch on the failure, I guess, to see the complexity, especially from those early Europeans that came over here. One of the stories from your Deep Time Dreaming book that, I don't know, it stood out to me quite a bit was the image of I think it was George Gray after he'd run aground or shipwrecked. Was that in Western Australia on the coast somewhere?
Yeah, up at Geraldton.
And then him having to walk essentially like quite a long way, 100 kilometers or more, and him writing in his diary about the images that he saw, and how, I mean, that to most people would never have witnessed that at all, but the level of society that I guess a lot of people discounted or thought that was actually going on, whereas he's got firsthand of how complex and sort of intricate the whole system of society was over that area. Would you mind just mentioning maybe that story and touching on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I write about Gray in the context of Sylvia Hallam's work, who's done so much to understand and reconstruct his insights and observations. Because I think the big thing there was he found these incredible yam fields. Yams, I'm saying this very general. Yams are kind of a tuberous vegetable that has many different forms. But he found them on these river flats, cropped and harvested at great scale, entire with kind of wells and paths moving throughout. And he describes walking and then looking from across one direction and looking across the other direction and just seeing yams as far as he could see in all directions. And yams were also these yam fields were so fixed and well defined that they're plotted on the early maps of Perth, and of a few different places, especially in WA. And the yams are the story of yams, and what kind of Sylvia Hallam's work realised was that, again, this is a domestication of a species, of the yam species, and the translocation. So translocation of plant species, that's moving a plant from one place to another, and it is kind of one of the new frontiers. It's been around for a long time, but we're learning so much all at once, with plant translocation due to emerging understandings of DNA. And what was the yams that George that Gray kind of saw on these river flats, and that we kind of coming all the way down to Noongar country, are you'd find them typically in kind of very different environments, because they're kind of often found on less rich areas, kind of rougher subtropical kind of spaces, but they've been brought down to the richest zones so they can be accessed and then harvested at a greater scale. And it's these were the first places that were kind of taken over as a part of the process of invasion, and the loss of the yams was replaced with that was the coveted land to set up new farms. But you also see the loss of yams happening really quickly, and the yams are so important because they are a staple source for societies across the continent, in different species, but still a constant staple, often managed by women, and they disappear really quickly as sheep get out, and the sheep feast on yams, and the yam daisy, the murnong, the garneg, they feast on it as they roam across the country, and the yam fields are eaten up, disappear. So this staple that's everywhere suddenly disappears. And even today, the species that have survived and that are now part of ecological restoration, people are repropagating yams and putting them back on country. They've often survived in areas like cemeteries that have been fenced, so that the yam daisies wouldn't be trampled or eaten. They have been protected in that little zone. So to look at the country today and then to look at George Gray's descriptions is you've got to understand what's happened in between, and what's happened is the process of invasion, and the ecological cost of invasion is a huge part of the truth telling that has to happen, and is happening, because the country has been transformed, but we get little glimpses as to what it was, and through story and also through these kind of journal entries, and it is eye-opening, and I say that through plant translocation, we're beginning to learn more and more about the continent, and some other examples you see with the black bean tree, which is being spread across New South Wales and northern New South Wales, and doing genetic testing on the black bean trees shows that not only they probably all came from the same seed, the same tree, but they're also spread out along a very specific songline. So the trees that erupt can now be seen to be associated with that songline, and a very physical manifestation of the story that is everywhere in landscape. And when you recognize it, you see, okay, that is not only a black bean tree where it perhaps shouldn't be, but that is where this ancestral being has stopped too.
Yeah, that makes you I think it's obviously quite a sad thought to have, but the amount of those stories and those songlines and different things that would have been lost since obviously Europeans came over and did what they did, which is quite makes you quite sad to think what could be there that just will never be known about.
Yeah, it's a heartbreak that is felt acutely, and I think that's very much part of of working in this space is is managing that trauma, and understanding that trauma, and often doing restoration work or talking about it is part of the healing that communities are doing. Healing the country by bringing water back, healing self and country by repropagating yams where yams once were. It is, I think, yes, there's loss, there's enormous loss, but what the big takeaway is, how much has survived despite this kind of cataclysm. There's so much has been lost, but not everything, and in fact, so much has survived and endures. And certainly, with the First Inventors, our new book, we're celebrating that cultural survival, the survival of cultural knowledge, the survival and revival of cultural practice.
Yeah, it's a great thing. And would you mind anything else you wanted to sort of mention or bring up regarding the new book? Because I know I've spoken probably a lot about your previous book, but was there anything that you thought was crucial to add in there?
No, I mean it's a juggernaut. It's of course written with Larissa Berendt and Sean Ulm. It's a collaborative enterprise. It draws on the show. We feel honoured and privileged, I certainly do, to be charged with telling these stories. And we've written it with so many communities across the continent, and they have an investment in this book, and it's such a privilege to have been charged with that responsibility to tell their stories. And we just hope it helps ignite curiosity, and to come back to the theme of the podcast, which is certainly how I dived into deep time dreaming. It was entirely through wonder, curiosity, a yearning to understand, to learn, and that has continued. And I think there's revelation after revelation in the field that I work, and we've tried to pack that into this latest book to try and again sustain wonder and help us think about the deep past in Australia as a living story, as a rich and diverse story, and as a story that can shape our future in really fundamental ways.
No, I think you're doing an amazing job with it, and I'm really excited to read the new book. Actually, do you know of any? I mean, maybe you can't say too detailed, but what sort of future discoveries or works are in the pipeline that you're aware of that are sort of really exciting coming up, or what have you got next? I guess after the book.
Well, I'm going back to understanding more about sea level rise and the big story there, and understanding more about the continent of Sahul. That's where I'm journeying. One of the areas I've been writing about, and that I think is probably one of the most exciting spaces, is understanding Australia's place in its region. We often think of Australia as being isolated at the end of the world, and that's false. There's these deep regional connections that are manifest in many different ways, and we're learning more and more about that. And so I think that's where we'll learn even more over the coming decades. We've found pottery up on Lizard Island, Igaroo, and the Great Barrier Reef, which speaks to this regional connection. It's locally made pottery, but it speaks to this regional connection across the Pacific. It's even the dingo itself. Where did the dingo come from? The dingo is a biological signature of this regional interaction. So Australia was arrived 3,500-4,000 years ago on the continent, and then quickly became went everywhere and became a crucial companion kin. What's interesting is you find when you dig into the genetics is that the genetic population of the dingo on Kagari, Fraser Island, is most closely connected to the genetic population of the dingo on the other side of the continent in Western Australia. The one that's just on the mainland offshore is another lineage connected to the New Guinea singing dog. but there's also a melting pot. There's kind of Solomon Islands dogs within the dingo ancestry as well. It's this kind of melting pot of ideas, of a biological melting pot there in the dingo itself, which we can't unpack because we still there's so much back and forth. There's so much regional interaction, and it's a far cry from the isolated at the end of the world. There is diplomacy, there's international history, there's global exchange happening in Australia, and it's really poorly understood. So that's one of the many places which I think is going to blow our minds as the years progress. It's very exciting, and definitely the communities that are involved, the Dengao on Yigaroo, are incredibly proud of the work that's underway and the role of their ancestors in kind of this regional interaction sphere.
That I think I'm gonna hopefully get my names right, but I was reading some work that I think was it Chris Irwin was doing regarding the trade routes between of the northern part of Australia and how far that goes back with some of the islands north of that. I mean, I didn't know about it, and I reckon a lot of people would be unaware of how far that that history of trade goes between thousands of years.
Absolutely, yeah. Chris has done wonderful work on mocassins, in particular, and the kind of this long history of interaction there. Lynette Russell has a huge body of work in this space too, and is looking at the familial connections between Makassar, Indonesia, and Australia, and how this trade not only involved trepang sea cucumbers, the kind of movement of goods, but also of people, and the family histories across those seas. It's an exciting space.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So where can people sort of keep up to date with everything that you've got going on then, Billy?
Oh, I keep a pretty low social media presence, and don't have an online website. But you can get my books about, and they're both available. The Deep Time Dreaming and the First Inventors are also audiobooks. So I'm a big audiobook listener these days, so I would please engage with the work in the field and ask questions. I think that's don't have to follow me, but follow the questions.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for your time, mate. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot from you, even though I've just only recently come into contact with all your work. But keep up the awesome stuff.
Thanks so much, Aidan. It's been lovely to talk.